Tonight on the Late Debate, as Southend Airport prepares for the return of passengers, bosses fear compulsory COVID tests are too costly.
If we get to a situation in which a test, which is required and is required multiple times, costs 3 times the price of a ticket on a low-cost carrier, then we do risk reducing it to the province of the rich, which it was.
And all change for London's rail commuters. But will the government's new plan get train journeys back on track? Good evening and welcome to the Late Debate. Green means go, red means don't, and amber, well, who knows? The government's traffic light system for foreign travel has been under scrutiny this week. At Southend Airport, they're preparing to open their doors and get planes back in the sky next week. But there are fears the rules are confusing and COVID tests too expensive. Southend Airport has been hibernating. There hasn't been a passenger flight since January. Airport staff have been furloughed. Around 20 employees were made redundant. And the crisis in the aviation industry has caused collateral damage. Because there are no passengers on planes, there's no one at the taxi rank.
We've really struggled, like I'm sure everyone has, to be honest with you. We've been here since day one. It's been really hard.
Next week, Southend will welcome back the first passengers, but they'll be confronted by the government's traffic light system of red, amber and green countries and rules about tests and quarantine. Tests are now available at the airport, but at £99 a go, it's not cheap or quick.
We would say allow 24 hours from the point that the test has reached the lab, so the testing happens here on site. The courier will then take it to a lab in Norwich and then you'll get your result within 24 hours. So enough time for the requirements when flying.
The airport's boss fears many of Southend's traditional customers simply won't be able to afford to fly.
If we get to a situation in which a test, which is required and is required multiple times, costs 3 times the price of a ticket on a low-cost carrier, then we do risk reducing it to the province of the rich, which it was, many years ago.
2 years ago, Southend Airport was a success story with a growing number of flights. But the pandemic changed everything. Last summer, EasyJet shut down its operation at Southend. The local MP has his own reasons for hoping the airport will prosper.
I think it isn't a secret, but I want Southend and I expect Southend to become a city. And with our wonderful sovereign celebrating 70 years on the throne next year, I do think that the airport, in terms of its viability, has got an important role to play.
A sentiment echoed by the businesses which rely on the airport.
Obviously, seeing planes in the sky is our biggest hope. Planes in the sky means passengers jumping into taxis, which is good for us.
A week tomorrow, the first passenger flights in 6 months will take off from Southend. But with so many unanswered questions about international travel, this is an industry which can't be sure of its final destination. On our panel tonight, Rupert Huck, the Labour MP for Ealing Central and Acton, Paul Scully, the Minister for London and Conservative MP for Sutton and Cheam, and zooming in from her home in the Liberal Democrat peer, Baroness Susan Kramer. Thanks for all of you for coming in and for Susan for joining us on Zoom. Paul, you're a government minister. We've heard a lot of different stories from government ministers today about what the rules are. So what are we allowed to do when going on abroad for a holiday?
Well, essentially, if it's a green country, then you're able to travel freely. You take your own view. With all of this, though, red, no, but amber is clearly, as I say, if you need to travel, if it's an emergency, if you've got a death in the family or those kind of things, or it's an essential,
got a holiday booked
essential
that you
business
can't
travel.
get a refund
well,
of?
These are the things. I mean, many of the airlines, and I've been looking at some of the interviews from the airline leaders, have been talking about because they've changed their refund policies over the last year because they know how difficult it is to get them restarted, and it is a challenge. Airlines remain a challenge whilst we're waiting for the world to catch up with their vaccination programmes up to the standard that we've had. We do have to be patient, and it's still going to be difficult for some time to come.
You clear, Rupert?
I mean, look, it depends which government minister you ask. So it's interesting to hear what Paul said, but then Lord Bethell said something completely different yesterday.
I think he was slapped down, wasn't he?
Said something else different. Boris Johnson said something different at PMQ. I mean, if the government can't sort of decide in themselves what the policy is, how is the public meant to understand?
Well, essentially, Rob, we're trying to change, so we're trying to move towards a position, like we did last year when we talked about Stay Alert, letting people have their own heads, understanding the risks around that, though.
Maybe there's a case for getting rid of amber. If it's so sort of flaky, you know, maybe you should do either yes or no, red or green. It's just confusing everyone at the moment.
Let's bring in Susan here. Susan, can I ask you, do you think people are going to obey the rules if they're this confusing?
I don't think people know how to obey the rules. They want to. I mean, look, I've got a daughter and my 2 grandsons in an amber country. It's breaking my heart not to see them, but I want to stick by the rules. Now, do I go if I'm very happy to make sure that I then self-isolate the proper way afterwards and do all the various tests, or am I being told not to go? I am completely confused. And honestly, I don't think I'm alone, and I don't think it's fair on people, quite frankly.
Paul, there is going to be a problem, isn't it? Is there, if people suddenly decide we've had enough of it or we don't understand the rules, compliance is going to be difficult.
Yeah, compliance absolutely is. I mean, what Susan was saying there, you know, people have had to make these choices over the last year. There's been a lot of people shielding, a lot of people having some really, really difficult situations. And I don't, underestimate that how concerning it will be for Susan not being able to see her family. But we're getting to a point when we actually have to let people have their head for the reasons that you've said. People have been like this for over a year now. But we've got to realise also that we've got to do our bit as members of the public and understanding that the virus has not gone away. This isn't just end, roll credits, suddenly it's all over.
Susan, you were a transport minister in the coalition government. What would you be doing, or what would your advice be now if you were still in office?
Well, clarity would. I mean, I have to say to Paul, I don't understand from his answer. Do I go or don't I go? I think clarity is absolutely essential. It may be tough, but it's something that we absolutely need. I want to pick up the point that was made by the speaker from Southend Airport. I'm very worried that the mechanism to prevent people going is just very expensive COVID tests. And surely it can't cost £99 to do a COVID test. I mean, there has to be a way to make sure that this is cheaper. And where people have situations like a bereavement or whatever else, surely those are the kind of situations where the government should pick them up. But you can't almost make that decision unless you've got the framework clear. Could we please have simple clarity on the framework?
Rupa, the cost, it's expensive. People can't afford to quarantine either. That's a worry.
Yeah, there should be support so that people can do this, because 10 days, even at home, people won't be able to afford to forego their wages for that long. And also, all these different traffic light things, they all get mixed up together at the arrivals at Heathrow. Anyway, you hear of people for 5 hours all being, you know, they come off different flights, they're at the baggage reclaim or whatever. So that just defeats the whole purpose of it. And there's a kind of separate FCDO list of where you're allowed to go. And then suddenly this traffic light thing came very, very late in the day. I mean, considering that we've had coronavirus for 14 months, only in, I think it was February, only a small number of countries on those lists. I think they need to rationalise it and get their story straight between the government.
Or do you think traffic lights perhaps was not the right answer?
No, I think it's, as I say, there are clearly some countries where it's just too risky to go. We do not want the risk of variants coming in and being spread, and we'll look at that as the data. There are other countries that I think we should just allow people to have their own heads. And Susan talked about clarity. I totally understand that. But on the other hand, we do sometimes, you know, at this point, have to start trusting people to make the right decisions, understanding that the virus is still here, but giving them a greater sense of freedom.
We heard from the boss of Southend Airport, and they had no flights at all for the first 6 months of this year. You represent a constituency very close to Heathrow. You must be very worried about a lot of your constituents losing their jobs.
I mean, again, I've had conversations with Heathrow. They would like a rates relief for all this and furlough to be extended, but we don't know. We keep reaching these cliff edges and then we don't know what happens after that. And again, sort of the whole crisis, a lot of companies like BA actually have taken advantage of this to do practices like fire and rehire, which is really insulting to people who maybe have worked 30 years for Heathrow to be let go and then told they can have a much worse contract. I don't know how that's still legal. That should be outlawed.
Paul, you're also a business minister as well as Minister for London. How much trouble is the aviation industry in? Can it get back on its feet?
Huge difficulty for them, clearly, over the last year. So we're coming up with an aviation framework with the industry through the Department of Transport, which is for that longer term recovery, and that will be reporting back in the next few months. But in the meantime, we want to make sure that we can get them started again, because it's about reopening and then recovery, and then building some resilience into their business models as well.
Of course, one of the reasons for possible caution in the roadmap is the arrival of the Indian variant. Susan, you live in southwest London, again close to Heathrow, not too far from Hounslow, which is the hotspot. It is worrying, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I sort of, I'm so frustrated, because I think if we'd had a working test, treat and isolate system really working well right from the beginning, we hopefully could have nipped this in the bud. And also, if we had, put India much earlier on the red list, I still don't buy the various arguments that I've heard the government for not doing that. And it's very troubling. And there will be future variants. So if each time we go through this, delay before we end up closing borders when we, to a new and severe risk, then how do we ever get completely out of this COVID round?
Ealing, Rupert, is one of the London boroughs where there's been a higher rate of infections than some of the others. It's worrying there.
Yeah, no, we were number one in London for a while, and we have had cases of the Indian variant. And I know our council has written today asking that we get surge testing and surge vaccinations as well to combat that. But I mean, it's true that this traffic light thing, again, that was only really recently. They just seem to be behind the curve, this government. They're meant to be flattening the curve, but all these things. And throughout the entire 14 months, the Piccadilly line, which I took to get in here today, people have been coming with no testing, no temperature, no anything through Ealing and Acton, which may be another reason.
Behind the curve, as Rupert says?
No, I mean, there was a point last year when we felt that we were sort of chasing the virus, but now we're very much trying to get ahead of it. So a lot of these variants are being discovered here in the UK because of our ability to do the genomic sequencing. So we're doing a lot of the sequencing for the world, but actually, you talked about Ealing. We've done a lot of the surge testing in Ealing originally for the South African variant and the Brazilian variants. But what we're finding in London at the moment is actually the other variants are being swapped by the Indian variant rather than increasing cases significantly. But they are increasing significantly in other parts of the country from a low base. So we've got to be ahead of it, and that's why we're hitting those areas hard so that we can keep on with the roadmap. And at the moment, it looks like that the vaccination is still effective against those variants.
It's a bit of a shocker, though, that we heard that for 3 whole weeks in May and April, test and trace, the data wasn't getting through to councils, and that's exactly when the Indian variant was surging. I
would point out that Sadiq Khan said this week, praising the government, he says that they've got a grip of test and trace. But anyway, for the moment, let's pause on that.
It just came out today, but yeah.
Now, as London opens up, more of us will be back on the trains. Many people working from home haven't missed commuting, haven't missed those soaring fares and delayed journeys. Well, today, the Transport Secretary announced the partial renationalisation of the railways. A new organisation, Great British Railways, is being set up in an attempt to put the bad old days behind us.
We are sorry to announce that the 10:54 Thameslink service to Brighton has been cancelled.
The 12:26 Thameslink service to Rainham has been cancelled.
Thameslink apologises for the inconvenience this may cause you.
Today's railway revolution has its roots in a meltdown which caused daily misery for tens of thousands of commuters.
Mommy!
3 years ago, new timetables on Thameslink and Great Northern unravelled with dire results, the cancellation of hundreds of trains. Today, the fallout from that fiasco spelt the beginning of the end of Britain's privatised railway network.
The industry is fragmented, it lacks accountability, and it's lacking in leadership. The chaotic timetable change of 3 years ago this week demonstrated the point, as did the government being forced to step in to take over failing franchises.
But the railway landscape has also been changed by COVID. The private train companies have needed huge government bailouts. No one knows when or if the days of the crowded commuter train will return. So the new Great British Railways will offer flexi tickets for people who plan to commute 2 or 3 days a week.
My constituents will particularly welcome the news about the flexible season tickets, which will be of huge benefit to commuters right across London and the South East, and particularly those who might be thinking of working from home more once all of the COVID restrictions are lifted. But I'm a bit concerned about what protection there will be for commuters from rail fares being unduly hiked.
The announcement today of Great British Railways doesn't change the way that fares have been capped up till now, for example. So all of those regimes will remain in place.
The government is using London Overground as its template. Fares and timetables are set by City Hall, but a private company has a contract to run the trains. The Mayor hopes it bodes well for a long-term financial deal for Transport for London.
The government copying the TfL model for the rest of the country is a vote of confidence in TfL. That's why it's really important to back up that vote of confidence, not just by copying the model around the country, but by giving us the financial support we need.
The biggest challenge for Great British Railways is to get passengers back on board. Susan, you're a former Transport Minister. Will you be shedding a tear for those names like South Western Railway and Great Western when they disappear, and welcoming Great British Railways?
Well, if you remember, Simon, I'm also was a founding board member of Transport for London, and I've been arguing for that model almost ever since then. That as a way to get the best you can out of the private sector, but really make sure that the whole transport network, the rail network, is directed at meeting the public needs. So I'm very pleased with the direction that they've chosen to go in today. That I am a bit like my colleague Sarah Olney, worried that this may turn out to be a mechanism that still leaves astronomical fare increases. That worries me hugely, and particularly because if we look at the settlement that took place during COVID, it seemed to me most parts of the country were protected in terms of their transport costs, and TfL got very badly kicked. I mean, there was an anti-London mood. Do you remember we'd asked to give up concessions for young people? There was an attempt to force the abandonment of the Freedom Pass, etc. So I'm concerned that part of it hasn't been dealt with. But in terms of the structure, I think this makes sense.
Paul, there are a number of worries about letting the government run the railways. Number one, if civil servants order the trains, you get trains with ironing board seats. We've already seen that on many commuter services in London. And secondly, if there's a squeeze on finances and the Treasury has to make cuts, they're going to go for the railways before they go for hospitals or schools, aren't they?
Well, there was, which was the original argument for allowing innovation through privatisation in the first place. But what happened, and as someone that has had the bruising experience of being a Southern rail passenger through all that trouble a few years back, and now a South Western passenger where things are better on my line at the moment, having a better relationship between track and train, where it's a little bit more seamless by moving towards a commissioning model rather than the franchising model, is got to be a good thing of getting the balance right between accountability through government but still having that innovation that the private sector can bring.
Rupert, Labour's had renationalisation of the railways in a couple of manifestos and a couple of general elections. You must welcome this.
Oh, it's a very popular policy, if only it were being enacted, but it's really what we've seen today is a bit of tinkering. It will still be private companies that are running these rail lines. And to be honest, actually, we've had state control of our railways for quite a long time. It just seems to be foreign countries' state rail companies running them.
That's because they own some of the train companies.
Yeah, so that's who's bidding for our franchises. So this is a bit of rebadging, but it's not real public ownership, let's call it that, which would mean that the profits go to the exchequer rather than to shareholders, which this will be.
The difference being that you're talking about profits. Now, I'm a bit older than you, I think, so I do remember commuting in British Rail. And
Don't talk about the sandwiches, because I think culinary tastes have gone up. People always say the sandwiches were rubbish.
If there were a sandwich on my line, I'd been amazed to have seen it. But no, from where I used to commute at the time, it was a couple of services per hour. There are now 6 services per hour, and the passenger numbers in that time have gone up significantly.
And you're saying that's down to privatisation?
So that's partly down to that innovation. That's down to that innovation that the private sector has been able to give the space. Whereas actually, otherwise, if you'd had the government running it throughout that time, what you'd have found, you may well have found those squeezes in finances. You certainly would be lucky to find a profit to actually go back into the Treasury in the first place.
What a boundary. There are other European nation states that manage it, okay.
just one of the key factors in this is that we have had a shift towards long-term commitments of funding. And that's absolutely got to stay, because that's the protection against, my goodness, we're in a tight spot, let's go cancel that rail project, let's hike the prices even more or whatever else. So we've got to get, we just had a white paper today, or a review, we need pieces put in that actually provide that certainty.
So you want to see a continuation, Susan, of these so-called 5-year control periods where funds are allocated for projects for 5 years?
That to me has made a whole lot of sense. I mean, whether 5 years is always exactly the right amount of time, I don't know, but it's long enough to give a degree of certainty. And I think everybody in this industry that needs some degree of certainty. It's uncertainty that gets people into a panic, causes inefficiencies, causes problems, causes cutting corners, and those kinds of things. So I think, again, clarity, consistency, predictability, all of those things are going to matter. And they're not guaranteed by any structure, but they could work well with this structure, as they have, frankly, with TfL.
Finally tonight, can we turn to the recent election, the re-election of Sadiq Khan as Mayor of London? Were you surprised it was closer than expected?
I mean, he didn't win on the first round, but I don't think anyone ever has since they created a Mayor of London. And he never took any vote for granted. He campaigns really hard. He came to Ealing, and I think he was fasting as well. He's like a dynamo. It was a good result, and it was more than Boris Johnson ever won London with.
Susan, what's happening to the Lib Dems in London? For the third time you came fourth behind the Greens, an even greater gap.
We feel that we're rebuilding fairly soundly in London. I mean, we've got 3 MPs, we control councils, we got a second Assembly member, we came very close to taking the South West constituency seat. We're in a rebuilding process, and I think you look around the country, I mean, by the time all the results came in, so we're looking as though we had a pretty decent uplift, and we were picking up seats on some key councils, and we took St Albans. So we're in that process, and it's building. One of the things that I've been so pleased with is so many of particularly the younger people who joined us in the last years have essentially taken the helm and are refreshing the party. And I think there's a vibrancy that is very strong and very positive. So the way that it's shaping, I'm pretty pleased with, quite frankly.
Paul, very quick question to you. Do you think Sean Bailey might have fared better if your party had put more effort into his campaign?
We put a significant amount. There's a lot of media stories around that, but there was a lot of media stories saying he was way behind, whereas we knew the energy that he was putting into it. He was actually speaking to Londoners about the issues that matter to them, rather than some of the areas that actually the mayor is just simply not responsible for. That's why he did well in this election.
OK, well, thank you to all of my guests tonight. That's all we've got time for tonight. So thanks to Rupert Huck, Susan Kramer and Paul Scully. We'll be back next month, but for now, thank you for watching and good night.